How are you guys doing this morning? Great, awesome, glad to hear it. If we don't know each other, my name is Pastor Hughes. I'm the discipleship pastor here at Midway, and I also get to preach and to speak on occasion, a little bit more because of the Shift Conference this week. But we are in a series in the book of Philippians. So if you're showing up for the first time this year, no judgment. Just realize we're about 4 sections into the book of Philippians. And we are looking at an overarching theme as we work chapter by chapter and verse by verse through the book of Philippians. And it's a very interesting theme. I have to wrestle with it because sometimes in my own personal life, I kind of struggle with this particular main idea, and it's finding joy despite the circumstances. It's finding joy no matter the circumstances. It's finding joy in all circumstances. And that's what we're seeing is the general theme and what Paul is trying to communicate to a group of people in Philippi, but not just any random group of people, the church in Philippi, and not just some random church in Philippi, but some of the closest and dearest friends of Paul. That these people have sacrificed and given, in some ways, even more than the churches that brought them into existence. Paul has seen their sacrifice time and time again. And so when he talks to the Philippians, sometimes he's just talking to church members, but when he's talking to the Philippians, he's talking to his friends. He's saying, you're going to see the inner workings of who I am because I found you trustworthy and you have found me trustworthy. And so together we're in this relationship, this ministry thing, and we're working it out in deep and true ways. And so what's interesting is we're coming to a section of this letter, this manifest between Paul and the people, and we're entering, ironically, since it's already a theme that I kind of have trouble with digesting and really looking at and producing in my life, some of the hardest and most complicated parts of the letter itself. Because what we're going to look at today, hopefully we're going to really kind of dig into it, is how do we have joy in the midst of suffering? Not in spite of the suffering, but in the midst of the suffering. How do we find joy, find purpose, find peace and understanding while we are in a season of suffering? And if you're like me, you go, well, I mean, that's kind of crazy. Yeah, I mean, is that even right? Because so many things in our culture, so many things in our time say, no, what you really need is to be happy, or you really need to avoid suffering and look for seasons and really appreciate the things that you get that keep you happy and lighthearted, and it's about enjoying moments of your life, and we try to avoid these seasons of our life where things get hard or things get real or anxiety comes in or having to deal with things in our life that aren't gonna make us happy and they don't feel lighthearted. And sometimes we choose those seasons and sometimes they are thrust upon us. But the challenge that Paul gives the Philippians is that we are called to have joy in suffering. Hopefully by the end of today, we get into that space. But really the question I want us to come around this morning is a very simple one. Is it worth it? Really, if we were to be honest here for a few minutes, we'd say, that sounds kind of crazy. And so the question I want to put forward today is it actually worth it to pursue joy in suffering? Shouldn't we try to just avoid the suffering like everybody else and maybe trying to eke out some happy moments and some happy thoughts and leave behind the suffering, and we can be joyful when it's time to be joyful, and in suffering, we'll just be miserable till it's over, and that's kind of the way life should work. surely in my season of suffering, I shouldn't put in the effort, the intentionality, the time to find joy in the suffering. But see, the hardest thing about this is there will be seasons of suffering in your life. And for many of us, there will be more seasons of suffering than there are good times. And when it comes to faith in Jesus, it's supposed to be about our whole life. And so if you choose to ignore your seasons of suffering, then you will choose to ignore much of what Jesus wants to do in your life. And you will go from an all-the-time faith to a some-of-the-time faith. And if, like I said, you are someone that suffers often, it won't even be the majority of your life. So when it comes to, is suffering, finding joy in seasons of suffering worth it? I think it's an important question for us to answer. Now, when it comes to being worth it, I don't know about you, but I measure things on like how necessary I feel it is in my life. I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, well, let me start with this. I am not one that really worries up until this point in my life with caloric intake. Okay? I like to eat what I want to eat, and recently some of you already know that my allergist said he doesn't think that the gluten allergy, that it is a gluten allergy, and so he just set me free. It's literally, I went in and the allergist spoke gospel into my life and said the donuts can come back, the muffins, but that's beside the point. The point is this. I've never, especially with cystic fibrosis, the doctors basically said, hey, listen, it's really hard for you to keep calories on your body, so just eat whatever you want. And then I passed that doorway called the 30s. And it's mysteriously crazy how some of the weight that never used to stick is starting to stick and remain. And remain. And so the other day, I was putting on my jeans, and I was having some trouble. And so the only logical conclusion, I yelled across the house, Jessica, did you wash my jeans in hot water? Because I think they shrunk. And she said, no, that's not what happened. I said, are you sure? Because I'm sure they fit a few weeks ago, and now they don't fit anymore. She said, I'm 100% sure that's not what's happening. I said, okay. I said, well, it's not that big a deal. It wasn't these. I was like, okay, I can just kind of stretch down into them. You know what I mean? Get down. And so I got in them, and I was like, it's all right. It's not a big a deal. Well, then another thing happened. I was asked to do a funeral. And now I'll let you guys behind the curtain. I really only have one nice suit. Okay, one nice suit. I'll marry you in it. I'll bury you in it. Hopefully it's one of the, but I really only have one nice suit. And so I went to put the pants on. And you could hear across my house, probably in my neighborhood, me going, ah! Ah! Because I was trying to exhale enough to squeeze enough to get it. And so then I had this terrible image in my head. I thought, I'm going to have to go to this funeral and be wearing the top part of my suit, but sweatpants on the bottom. And those people are going to say, is that pastor wearing sweatpants behind that podium? And then that moment, it quickly became worth it to start to lose some weight, or at least to start to monitor the calories that I'm putting into my body, because I don't want to be the pastor that's known for wearing sweatpants to funerals. I don't want to be the pastor that's known for popping a button in the middle of a funeral. And so all of a sudden it quickly became worth it, but that's the whole thing. Is it worth it? Because I'll tell you this, finding joy in suffering will take an intentional process. It will cost you something. But the real thing we're going to wrestle around today is it worth it? This morning, if you have your copy of God's word, you can go with me to Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. We're working through verse by verse, chapter by chapter. So we are starting in verse 12 this morning. This is what it says. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and a crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like the stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. And even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and the service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. The first thing I want to point out as we step into this passage this morning is something that I think may be subtle to first-time readers or for us that are not trained to kind of see where Paul is taking this passage. There was obviously something going on with the Philippians where they were having to deal, even though they were well-loved, even though they had produced many great things for Jesus. But there's something going on within the internal strife of the Philippian church that we'll see more as we progress through this letter. But in this moment, Paul comes to them and says, hey, listen, because of what's going on in your situation, because of the sufferings you are experiencing, this is what I want to say to you. You need to not grumble, and you need to not argue. And it's interesting because if you had kind of grown up in a Jewish context or you kind of knew the history of the story of God's people, this passage would actually light up to you in neon because Paul is trying to say something very specific in this moment. See, when he says, don't grumble, and he says, don't argue, these were the two things that the children of Israel in the Exodus under Moses were indicted for over and over again. They leave Egypt and they're out in the desert and they don't have water and they start to grumble and argue against Moses. They're in the wilderness and they don't have food. Now they have water, but they begin to grumble and they begin to argue. God says you're going to have to go in and conquer the land. They begin to grumble and they begin to argue. He says they feel like they don't have proper leadership. They feel like Moses is getting favoritism from God, so they begin to grumble and they begin to argue. And what we see in this moment is Paul is saying to the Philippians, hey, listen, I know that you find yourself in an interesting lot and season of life. This may not be exactly as you planned it or what you wanted, but listen, you don't need to grumble and you don't need to argue, because like the people of Israel, God was doing an amazing, unforgettable, beautiful thing with their story. And in the meantime, what they were doing was undercutting the authority and the divinity and the purpose for which God was moving in their lives. Say, listen, it is attached to their seeing of the world, this grumbling and arguing, and it demonstrates their lack of faith. Paul's not super harsh on the idea of negative self-speak or having an issue with someone. He's not saying, oh, don't you ever argue or don't you ever grumble. No, there's this level of rebellion that sits in these words that says, don't grumble and don't argue against what God is trying to do in this moment. And I don't know about you, I'm guilty of grumbling every once in a while. I did not have to go very far for a tangible example. This week would suffice. I remember Sunday night we had Common Space, and typically I'm the primary communicator at Common Space, and so I had done the lesson that night, and I came home about 10:30, 11 o'clock. I got in bed, and then I coughed all night. I'm sure my wife really appreciated that. You know, the midnight preacher man comes in, and she was sleeping up till that point, and I just started coughing for the rest of the night. And so when I woke up on Monday morning, getting ready to go to work, I couldn't talk. Yeah, I mean, most people in the office, they realize I was like, you know, I mean, it just wasn't there because my vocal cords didn't have an opportunity to reset, to heal. And I woke up, but I was still feeling good, and I was getting ready for work, and I realized as I was getting ready, I had plugged in my insulin pump so that it would have plenty of battery for the day, and when I went to get my insulin pump out of the wall, it had successfully charged negative 30%. I was like, what? I plugged you in, and now you're saying, it was like beeping at me, saying like, oh, warning, low battery. And it's like, but you had plenty of battery before I even plugged you in. And so, you're sitting there and you're dealing with these problems and you're getting late for work and you're getting aggravated. Or maybe that's just me. When things don't go according to my plan, I get aggravated. That may be news to some of you. But, and so then on the way to work, all I can think about is this. Man, I'm going to have to get on a 1-800 number because I think the pump is broken. And guess what I get to do with a hoarse voice for like the next hour and a half, repeatedly explaining myself to the 6 people that I'll end up talking to. I'll be talking the whole time. And I know how this is gonna go. My pump is broken. Huh? Excuse me, sir? My pump is broken. Can you fix it? And so I got to work, and I'm calling this, and it's just grumbling is what starts to happen in the midst of my suffering. I'm like, God, this is so unfair. I'm trying to serve you. We got junk to do for the shift conference, and I can't talk, so that'll be great for the anxiety levels of Chad and Todd when they realize oh yeah, you're supposed to speak 8 times and on Sunday morning. And so I'm just sitting there getting angrier and angrier. I'm like, God, this is just so unfair. Has anybody else ever been in that moment? Why? Because I'm wired in a lot of ways to grumble. I'm wired to grumble. And then so grumbling, Paul says, refrain from it. And what's interesting is then he says, don't argue. So don't grumble, but also don't argue. The first point I wanted us to see was when we are in a season of suffering, we are tempted to grumble. We're tempted to grumble. We feel like we deserve it. Man, this bad stuff doesn't happen to anyone else. And so I deserve to let you know, God, how you're not meeting what I'm asking for. The second point is this. When we are in seasons of suffering, we are tempted to argue. Many of us, I think, when we get in a season of suffering, when things get hard, we are tempted to argue. It's why the first year of marriage can be so hard for many people, right? Because not only are you dealing with this other person, but you're also dealing with a lot of the hardships that come up in processing this new relationship. And I remember Jessica and I were in Los Angeles, and we had just dealt with the great migration of the fleas through our apartment. And so we were living it. We didn't have a whole lot of money. We'd moved into this house, and the walls, this is not an exaggeration, were about that thick. They didn't have any insulation. We lived off one little outlet because basically the way they wire things in California is like, hey, just do what you want. What's OSHA? And so they had run one outlet basically to our house in the guest house. And so we would basically, if you ran 2 space heaters because of the insulation, you'd blow the circuit. And then you got to go outside in the dark and fight the wild animals and flip the circuit breakers all back on. And so this is just the place in which we live. And some people have lived in worse, and we've definitely lived in better. But dealing with these things, dealing with these moments. And I didn't really realize, maybe you don't really realize how poor you are until someone else tells you how poor you are, right? And I remember I went into a doctor's appointment and I was sitting down and they had me filling out this yearly questionnaire, I guess asking about my mental health. If only you knew. And, and it asks you stuff like, well, if you feel comfortable, what's your race, what's your salary, and stuff like that. And so I had filled all this stuff out, and this nurse came in looking really guilty. And she came in, she said, Luke, if you and your wife ever need a bag of groceries, you just call the office and we won't ask any questions. There'll just be a bag of groceries sitting there. And it was very sweet. It was very loving. But I was like, how poor am I? You know what I mean? In that moment. But the crazy thing is, it's amazing how we are tempted in our suffering to argue, right? Because the main point in arguing versus conflict, negotiation is I want to be right. And, you get a newly married husband, a newly married wife, and they both are right until one of them dies. And so in this midst of suffering, you're faced by these challenges, called into dealing with the problem. But what you're gonna try and do with all of your might and all of who you are is prove that you are right. So Paul says, listen, in times of suffering, don't grumble, because it's not all about you. And with others, don't argue, because it's not all about you. In seasons of suffering, we are tempted to grumble and to argue. See, and then Paul explains why this is. Verse 15, it says, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and a crooked generation. Then you will shine like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. So this is what God desired for Israel, right? When he's pulling them out of Egypt, he's bringing them into the promised land. He says, no, listen. You're gonna be the children of God. You are my offspring. You are a priest and a healing salve to the nations. But because of their grumbling and because of their arguing, they began to undercut and disenfranchise all that God was hoping to do. Now, it's not that God didn't have the power to achieve it. It's that they were belittling and making little in the eyes of the other nations, but also in their own reality, who God truly was to them. Because of the grumbling and because of the arguing, they were ripping apart the narrative of what God was doing in bringing them into freedom and to purpose and to life. See, that's why Paul in this moment says, you too don't grumble and don't argue. Why? Because you are the children of God. And if you lean into the true reality of what I am trying to do, what God is trying to do through your lives, then you're gonna shine like stars in a crooked, in a warped generation. You're gonna look around and you're gonna realize we are believing and holding on to something that is so dear and so necessary that we are moving in life when the rest of the generations seem to be falling in death. You'll move as the children of God as you hold firmly to the word of life. And this verb, holding firmly, in the original text, it's funny because it's not this passive defensive stance. It's not like, okay, we're going through some hard times, and so what we should do is we should circle the wagons and maybe we'll get through it. Maybe we'll be able to hold on. No, it's this idea of because of knowing the ground and knowing where you are standing, you take up a defensive position that will ultimately move forward. Hold the ground and then take the ground. Hold the ground and then take the ground. And so what Paul is saying in this moment, as he explains it, it's just like me pouring a drink offering over into your sacrifice. And you should rejoice in my sacrifice, because what we're holding on to is the ultimate reality of what God has spoken to us, that he is the victory, that he is the one that moves us forward, that he is our defense. And so in the season of suffering, we look different because we know what's truly at the end of all ends, what is going on. So rejoice with me, because I'm in a tough spot. And I'll rejoice with you because you are in a tough spot. But we have the words of life, and nothing will be able to come against us. So in this reality, I think many of us, we detract from what God is really doing. We begin to go, it's not fair. Why can't my wife or someone else in the community, why can't my church members, why can't my friends in life group, why can't they just get it? God, why do I have to suffer in these moments? And that's really probably what was going on in the Philippian church. Like I said, we're going to learn more about it as we move through the chapters. But what's going on is internal strife in the church. I know it's hard to believe, but every once in a while, even when a church is moving in a great direction, if people get their eyes off of the obstacles that they're trying to accomplish together and onto each other as their opponents, suffering happens. And so God's character in reality is not belittled, but God's narrative and story spoken by his people is belittled. But the reality is something altogether different. And that's what Paul is inviting the people into. It reminded me of a moment that I saw on video over the last few weeks. And it was more poignant to me because I feel like it's several questions that we as a community have struggled with over the last few months anyway. That we've had moments in the community where we have asked God for miraculous moments, where we've had healing that needed to happen, where we've had moments where we've said, God, reveal your glory. And you have this awesome opportunity, God, in this person's life and in this person's life to move in a real and in a powerful way. God, there is suffering and you can alleviate it. And we'll give you your glory if you will alleviate the suffering. Man, that would just be a symbol, Lord. And time again, we've prayed these things. And for many of those stories, I'm sure some have been good, but we have experienced the disappointment of the suffering. And I just was taken to a moment, I think a guy named Jonathan Evans, his mother, Dr. Lois Evans, is the wife of a very notable preacher and author, Dr. Tony Evans. And they have a church out in Dallas. And basically, Lois, when she got cancer, they began praying and asking God to move because it was a very aggressive form of cancer. And so recently she passed away. And her son, Jonathan, was given the opportunity to do the eulogy. And I just kind of wanted you guys to hear what Jonathan went through in this moment. We're getting ready for the video. In this moment, what Jonathan fleshes out as the reality of what God is doing with many of those questions for us. So you guys pay attention to this video.
But I just want to tell you, just for a moment, trust me, I won't be long. I just want to tell you that my thoughts over the past few days, I was wrestling with God. Because I said, well, if we have victory in your name, didn't you hear us when we were praying? Didn't you see the people who are walking around my mom and dad's house like Jericho trying to make sure that they can knock down the walls of this cancer? Didn't you hear the prayers of Bishop T.D. Jakes and Brian Carter and Antioch and Friendship West and Gateway and the Village? Didn't you hear all of those prayers? Didn't you hear us? Where are you? Why didn't you do what we were asking of you? Because your word says that if we abide in you and your word abides in us, then we could ask whatever we will and it will be given to us. Your word tells us that if we ask according to your will, that you hear us. Your word is telling us that in Mark 11, if you pray believing, you will receive. To be anxious for nothing, but through prayer and supplication, make your request known. Where are you? I was wrestling with God the last few days because this was a great opportunity that we can tangibly see your glory. Everybody was praying, not only in Dallas, but around the country and around the world. People were watching. Where are you? This was an opportunity for us to see your glory. And as I was wrestling with God, he answered. And he said, number one, you don't understand the nature of my victory. Because just because I didn't answer your prayer your way doesn't mean that I haven't already answered your prayer anyway. Because victory was already given to your mom. You don't understand. Because of the victory that I have given you, there was always only two answers to your prayers. Either she was going to be healed or she was going to be healed. Either she was going to live or she was going to live. Either she was going to be with family or she was going to be with family. Either she was going to be well taken care of or she was going to be well taken care of. Victory belongs to me. Because of what I've already done for you, the two answers to your prayer are yes and yes. Because victory belongs to Jesus.
That'll preach. Suffering does not slight the victory. Suffering does not slight the victory. The only time that the victory is starting to be slighted is when we grumble and when we argue against what God will accomplish with or without us for his purpose. But I want to champion and lift high what he's doing. The next part of the passage are two concrete examples of people wrestling through grumbling and arguing. Paul says in verse 19, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I also may be cheered when I receive good news about you. I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare, for everyone looks out for their own interests and not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served me in the work of the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things go with me, and I am confident in the Lord that I myself will also come soon. But I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and he almost died. But God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I am all the more eager to send him, so that you may see him again, and you may be glad, and I may be less anxious. So then welcome him in the Lord with great joy, and honor people like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ. He risked his life to make up for the help you yourselves could not give me. And so to experience joy in suffering within community, we must take up others' interests. This is why Paul is sending Timothy to the Philippians in this moment. He knows there's wounding. He knows there's suffering inside this community. And so he sends Timothy, a concrete agent, a concrete example. And he says this of Timothy. He says, I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare. See, going back to the story of me and Jessica, things began to get better. Things began to change when our perspective and our mindset began to shift, not to our own welfare, not to fighting to be right, but fighting for the other person's heart, soul, mind. We began to care about the other person's welfare, the other person's interests. And the obstacles became the thing that we were warring against as we moved together. Even though the suffering didn't change, our joy in it changed. And it's so crazy because you meet couples all the time and say, man, some of the worst years of our life were the best years of our life. And that's true for me and Jessica. The suffering in the season, I wouldn't change anything or trade it for anyone, because it was in those moments that God taught us that we were more than enough for each other in him. But it came in the shifting of our perspective to understand, oh, it's about your welfare and not my arguing for mine. And then you have Epaphroditus, a man that almost lost his life for the gospel. What we see about Epaphroditus is this: joy in the middle of personal suffering taps us into the true reality of God's victory. That joy in the middle of personal suffering taps us into the true reality of God's victory. Because Epaphroditus was living for what truly mattered. And see, I think it's sometimes in our culture, in our time, we think, man, that would be crazy for someone to be willing to sacrifice and to risk and give up so much that they would lose their life for the gospel. That they would lose their life for the good news of Jesus. And what you find in Epaphroditus is that he was not giving up or leaving behind some kind of mentality that was going to take life from him, that was going to take happiness from him, but he was actually finding the purpose for which he was created. So instead of grumbling, instead of finding himself in his circumstance and being like, why is this me? God, I came all the way to Paul in prison, and you're gonna kill me with a cold. You're gonna kill me with sickness. I came here and it's just not fair, Lord. No, Epaphroditus came to serve Paul, to serve the needs of the gospel. And Paul says, no, listen. I'm sending Epaphroditus back with this letter. Epaphroditus is actually the one it's the reason we have Philippians. Epaphroditus held that letter of Paul in his hands and took it back to the church at Philippi. He says, no, listen, I'm putting this in this letter. You honor men like this. Because why? They get it. They get the ultimate reality of what I'm talking about here, what I'm underpinning here, how joy in suffering comes, that there is something greater and bigger and stronger than the temporary moments that we find ourselves in. And see, this is the great struggle for me. If you go back to my story at the beginning, I was in that moment where my pump is broken and everything is bad and I can't figure out why it's not fair and I'm struggling with this and we're trying to serve the Lord. And what I found in this moment was, you know what happened? 4 hours later, my pump just fixed itself. It just fixed itself. And how much of my soul's energy and my mind's anxiety had I wasted in the season of suffering? Why? Because there's something bigger going on. I have this question that haunts me. How much personal suffering would I be willing to go through that others may know the gospel, that others may know who Jesus is? I'm not talking about my discomfort. I'm not talking about giving up some of the frivolous things in my life. How much would I be willing to hurt so that someone else would know the hurts that Jesus endured for them? Epaphroditus was willing to give up everything. The last point is this, as we close. When we have joy in suffering, we know that the only source must be divine. Going back to the beginning, I think, is where we find, is it worth it? Back in verse 12 and 13, it says this: continue to work out, or the actual language there is grind out, push forward with intensity and purpose, even though it hurts. Grind out your salvation with fear and trembling. Verse 13, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. See, if we only serve God and obey God in moments and seasons where things are light and easy, then we will miss the joy of dealing with the suffering and finding that it is only God alone that can move in our life. If you're like me, you sit around and you wonder, man, I would love to know that God is actually moving with me, that something divinely inspired is happening in my life, but how do I do it? And if you're only serving God in moments of ease, if you're only serving God in moments of excess, you're right, you're never gonna know. Was it because you got the car that you're willing to serve God? Was it because you had the money you were willing to serve God? Is it because you were in a good mood that you were willing to serve God? But in the moments where you are not enough, in the moments where you are weak, in the moments where you lack, if you find joy in suffering, buy into what God is writing and doing, then you know the only thing that would be coming and producing that is the source of the Holy Spirit in you. So do you want to know that God is moving in your life? Find joy in the suffering, and it will be worth it. It will be worth it. Paul says it like this in 2 Corinthians. He says, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, a suffering to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in my sufferings, in my difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Then I am strong. We find joy in suffering. It is worth it, because then we know that we are wrapped in the arms of Jesus. If you question and if you wonder, search for the joy in the suffering, because it can only be him in those moments. This morning, would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? You may be like me, and you may have blamed God, mistrusted God, doubted God, grumbled against God, argued against God, because you said, it's not fair. I'm suffering, Lord. Get rid of the suffering, and then I will serve you. And God is whispering to you, no, no, no. Rejoice in the suffering, for my power is made perfect in weakness. In you, there is purpose for perfection if you'll just lay down your life for me. If that's you this morning, you say, I want to trust Jesus. Say, I want to, for the first time, not use my own suffering as an excuse. Pray something like this with me. Jesus, I'm sorry for only looking at myself. Would you forgive me? Would you show me how to live for your love? How to live for a relationship with you? To live for something bigger than myself. I'm all in if you'll have me. Amen. And the answer of the Lord is yes. I'll have you. Over and over again. Yes, yes, yes. You are loved. And I will make a difference in your life. Pastor Ryan, would you come and close us?
Thank you, Luke. Let's give the Lord a hand for what he's done through worship and teaching of God's word.